Hey, I'm Nick Leonard. I'm the product designer in the project management group. I'm going to talk a little bit about adding a status field to planning items, sort of where we're at and where we're going, and what that's going to look like. So as a bit of background, the job to be done here is, kind of the main job that we have is delivering a product enhancement. And as part of that, when you're collaborating, users need to radiate the current status of work so that everyone's aligned, right? If no one can see kind of where something is at, it makes it a lot harder for the team to kind of work together and for product managers and engineering managers in particular to kind of report out that status to their stakeholders or to follow up on things that are not going as planned because they don't really know. They have to do a lot more work to figure it out. Um, so in GitLab today, as I'm guessing all of you know, um, status is a combination of labels in most cases, sometimes scope labels and sometimes not, just depending on the team, whether they have access to scope labels and just how they set that up whenever they decided to set that up. And there's a number of problems that we kind of observe with this, and again, I'm guessing a lot of you have felt this yourself. The first of which being that status as a label is just not really the most familiar mental model to a lot of people, especially if they're coming in from more PM-centric products, where status is often like a very central field that you configure and use. So this idea that you can open an issue and not see anything resembling status. There's kind of open and closed, but that doesn't really tell you about the workflow. And that you then have to know that you go and create labels to do all this. It's kind of like an initial barrier that users have to overcome. And even once they do that, okay, now it's a label. Well, you might have other labels. It's not required, which is a problem for a lot of users. They want everything to have a status since everything has a status, like if you're working in a team. It can be hard to find because again, like if you've used labels in GitLab, we have hundreds of labels. Customers don't always have quite so many, but you might still have a bunch of labels that you want just to categorize things more generally. Now they're mixed in with all your workflow labels, and every time you want to change the status, you're looking through not, 10 things that maybe represent your workflow, but maybe 30, 40 things that represent any sort of categorization you might want to do. There's no order to these, right? Like your last status might be before your first status because it's alphabetical. Um, and even once you do have it applied, right? Like this is the status right here, workflow planning breakdown. It's sandwiched in between all of these other things. Again, a lot of customers don't have quite so many labels, but even with 4 or 5, this data point's rather, lost in the sea of other sort of colored objects. Um, and then once you get to the board, which is sort of synonymous in a lot of cases with status for a lot of teams, you have to go in and add a list for every status that you create. As you manage your statuses through labels, you then have to go and update your board to, add another status, reorder those in the order you want. It's just a lot of work that somebody has to go through to actually implement and use this really basic concept of workflow that's kind of central to project management. So definitely a lot of opportunity here. It's also something that gets reflected from customers regularly. Some of our customers that have been in GitLab for a while, I think, have just sort of internalized this is how it works. But as people try to bring other teams in, they kind of find that anew. So like in this case, they tried to bring in their product team and they do not like using labels and have problems using labels. If you look through some of our other feedback, you'll see things like labels, labels, labels. There's labels everywhere. Why are we using labels for every single thing? And I agree. I think we do a little bit better, especially for something as important as status. So what we want to do is introduce a status field. So decouple this from labels. It's kind of the first in a number of steps I think that we're going to take to decouple things from labels and make labels less of the catch-all for everything and sort of more true to its core purpose as a categorization tool. And so in the first iteration, we'll have a fixed list of statuses that users can use on tasks. And the reason this is like so small is really just to scope this down as a first iteration. And then tasks is like a great use case where typically there's not so many statuses that are applicable. Tasks in most organizations are meant to be done in like a day. Nobody's going to go in over the course of a day and change the status 5 times. They're going to kind of just indicate that they're working on it and maybe when it's done. We also want to be able to indicate when something is closed but not done. So that's a problem users have today as well, that you might close an issue because it's just something you're not going to do, or you decided you're going to go a different route. It all kind of looks the same though when you just look at the list of closed issues. Is it done? Is it not done? You kind of have to dig in a little bit more. So we have like this not doing status as well to sort of help differentiate and make it easier to see which items are completed and not. And then kind of the real like functional parity here from labels will come in the second iteration, where we'll be allowing users to configure status basically like they can do for labels. So in this case, you could create a backlog status, approval needed status, all these different statuses that your team might use. We're also going to provide some migration tools. So knowing that most teams today already have this set up as labels, we want to make it really easy for them to transition off of labels and into status without having to go in and like manually move hundreds or thousands of issues from a label to a status. Like ideally we can do a little bit of that mapping on their behalf and make that pretty seamless, but the end result being that each team can have kind of the statuses that they were building as labels now as a status component, which we're showing in this slightly modified to badge format. So it looks a little bit like a label, but it's differentiated in a couple different ways. One of which being that the color is only applied in the icon, and that it has an icon. The icons are not configurable. They're tied to categories, which I can talk about in a second. But users can configure the title and the color much like they can with labels, but we'll avoid a little bit of the like color sort of volume that we're getting from labels today. This is something that we explored quite a bit. I'll just like zoom out for a second so you can see like all these sort of different, like this is probably not even all of them, but like different variations of like how we present labels in different ways with different amounts of color. We kind of looked a lot at just like what sort of elements on an issue. And anytime I say issue, like epics, task, it's all, they'll all kind of use status in the same way. And there's a lot of different components that bring like visual elements and color into the page that will be in some ways competing with, or just sort of adding to the overall sort of presentation of the issue. So we looked at all these, trying to figure out like how we can give it kind of the right level of priority. Like, could we shift labels and make them less visually noisy, through something like this, which is something we explored, but we, didn't kind of go down this route for now for a number of reasons. But other fields like badges and things, like what can we kind of pull back, and then how can we get status that's sort of there, but not quite as just sort of colorful and the Christmas tree effect that we have today when you look at our list page with all the labels. And so this is kind of where we landed. And thanks in particular to Jeremy for he and I collaborated a bit on this, and with Nick Brandt as well, to kind of land on this solution that we feel like gives that level of importance. It's still sort of called out as an element that when you look at it and like a list view will stand out, but without sort of the overwhelming sort of volume of color that we see in some cases today. And then where this is going to go. So this is sort of where we're at right now, like working through some of the details of how exactly this will work. As we start thinking about groups and projects and different types of objects, and how we can like package statuses in a way that's a little bit easier to use than labels. So with a label, every label from the group and every label from the project is available on any object, right? Like epics, issues, tasks, OKRs, and MRs as well. all use the same set of labels. With something like status, we know that not every status is applicable to every type of thing. Like epics typically don't need to have the same level of detail as an issue or a task might. They're a little bit higher level. You don't really have like an epic that's in QA. The lower level objects kind of flow in that sort of way. We also know that every team, even within the same organization, teams work differently. I was talking to a customer or a user in a validation session for status yesterday that was kind of like working on two different teams and describing how like one team does Kanban and another does like Scrumban, and they have different statuses and different needs between those two teams. So we need to make it really easy for them to kind of represent the workflow based on like how they actually work. So the idea right now is this idea of life cycles. So a life cycle would be a container of statuses that could then be shared and sort of opted into on a item by item basis. So in this case, you have a lifecycle called strategy, which exists in the group. So it's available to any subgroup or project under that group. But then you would assign this at the project level, let's say, to like your epics and objectives. So you could actually choose not to use this at all. You could have a bunch of, you could have a Kanban one, a Scrumban, Scrum, product development lifecycle, whatever you want to have kind of at the group level, and then at the project level, they can kind of define which ones they actually want to use, or they could create their own, like in this case, where they've added their own status and their own thing specific to kind of how that team works. Because we certainly know that's the case where one team might have specific sort of security workflows or QA workflows that are different from the rest of the organization. So we want to like share as much as possible, but also give that sort of control where you're not getting overwhelmed by everything that could ever exist. Just as like a little peek of like what we're testing right now. So this is research that's currently ongoing, just around like configuration of the workflow, right? Like how do you add status and find where to add status and do that sort of work. Focus, I think some of the things we're finding initially from research is that like people look in settings, but the plan label is maybe less obvious than it doesn't seem to resonate as much especially for non-users. It's like that's something we're going to look at a little bit more, but the general workflow of adding statuses and this sort of categorization I mentioned, where you have basically a done category and a canceled category that will automatically close issues, and then some other categories that are used more for like filtering and reporting. Generally makes sense, and people can like pretty quickly figure out how to add like a status in line, edit statuses, all from this interface, and then actually use them in an issue, like here, and apply the status that they've added. That'll works pretty well from what we found, but I think we still have a little bit to solve first around the navigation side and how people find this, and then like I said, still some details to sort out around how you package and consume statuses across sort of the group project hierarchy and make sure that each item has kind of the right workflow available to it. A lot more I could get into here, but I linked the epic in the agenda with a lot more details if you're curious, and happy to answer questions if we have time. It looks like we have a few minutes. Chad, I see your note about designing in dark mode. I did design I made sure that the status component at least had a dark mode, and I used this as an excuse to build that out a bit more. But there's most of the design is in light mode, but we did make sure that the status component was dark mode, because the other thing is, since that color is user defined, there is a level of like contrast that we have to be concerned about. So we explored some like different rules too around like how we could adjust that that color, the user defined color, to ensure a level of contrast if needed, using some like algorithmic adjustments. So like if they define that the color is white on this gray background, it's not going to work very well. So in light mode, we could adjust that up. in dark mode where the background is different, we may not need to do that same sort of adjustment.
Vitica, it looks like you have a question. You want to
Yeah,
go the last?
right. Thank you. Nick, I was just curious because I was looking at your designs, and I did not find what we place as open and closed labels on the issues. So is the proposal suggesting that those are going to go away and we're only going to be using statuses?
No, I think we did consider that. We also consider whether we would be like expanding that. So basically inserting status into that paradigm of, so it would be kind of open and then in progress and then something else enclosed. But I think what we found would be the easiest way to sort of support this while sort of not breaking lots of stuff was to retain open and closed, but deprecate it a little bit. So there is like a one-to-one connection basically between status and open and closed, where based on the category of the status, so if it's to do or triage or in progress, then the
Mm-hmm.
item will be open. If it's done or canceled as a category, then the item will be closed. And then we'll have a default. So users can define what the open default and the closed defaults are. So if they just like close the issue using some like a /close command like we have today, it'll just automatically go into the status that is set as the default. But it does mean that like, so in this case, this would be open. And I think we're looking at not showing the open badge when something is open and basically just using the status to indicate where this is at and assuming that anything you don't see is closed is open, and only indicating when something's closed. We do this today in like the all tab. If you look at the issues list, like we only show when something's closed. Um,
Yeah,
it's so it gives some visibility to that, but kind of puts more of the focus on the status for something that's open.
got it. And I mean, this is really a great improvement from what we have today. But I was just imagining about situations such as sometimes when we revisit some issue, we figure out that even though it's at a particular stage in workflow, let's say development, it's not valid anymore. The problem is not valid anymore, and we need not work on it any further, and we just close it. So, in such scenarios, would um, would there be a closed badge along with status wherever it was in the like workflow? How would it look like? I'm just trying to imagine.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I have a good example. I'm not sure I have an example of that specifically, but it would be, so I would think in that case you would mark the status as not doing, which
Okay,
would automatically close the issue as well.
got it.
So then when you look at that later, you could see that it was, in this sort of not doing status and differentiate that from something that was completed.
Got it. Thank you so much. And I just have a small nitpick that the icon that I saw for deployment in one of the lists that you were showing, it's a pipeline status icon and not a status icon. It's not
Okay,
here.
it's
It was in
okay.
the other list. Yeah, it had a white fill. That's all.
Oh, okay. It's possible that was just uh in that one of the icons that we're using in the other cases are the generic status icons that
Got it.
shouldn't be pipeline specific.
Thanks.
I guess I have the next point that's not read only. Yeah, I was curious a little bit around how we're deciding how much flexibility to give the users. I was curious, Nick, if it was thought about whether we could just give a boilerplate of statuses and just say, this is going to work for most. It may not work for everybody's unique workflow. Like we might have a GitLab, but the trade-off being we wouldn't have to deal with all of the complexity around giving users the option to customize this entire workflow.
Um, it's definitely something we considered, and that is the first MVC is that we'll give basically like a Kanban style boilerplate of to do in progress done. But I think we've talked to a lot of teams. I even have like the manuals that some teams have created where they detail like their statuses and how to use them. And I think it would be almost impossible to hit like 100% or even close to it with something like that. And like my fear then is that we have this outcome of like, well, we still have statuses and we still have labels, and that's kind of like worse than where we're at now, because then they're setting the status to like in progress and then a label that's like in progress, in testing. And you're having to kind of combine those two things. And I really don't want that to be the outcome, because I think that'll be even harder to use than than what we have today, where at least you could do everything with labels. So I think, like, just given the vast sort of variability of teams, configuration is kind of like an inevitable endpoint, but I would like to avoid it. It would make it much simpler.
Yeah, I got you. Thanks for clarifying. Valerie, did you want to vocalize your question?
Yeah, I was curious. Is part of this direction related to migrations from other tools like Jira? It would be hard to map one-to-one for statuses and other tools to our tool, and then how do you assist users to getting their things loaded into our product?
I do think that's something that this would benefit. But I actually think this is something that even like users who are already in GitLab struggle with. So it's not just migrating. I mean, it's definitely like any project management tool, not just Jira, has like configurable statuses in it as a feature. So it is something that users kind of expect from if they're coming from something else. But I also think it's something that users already here like need better support for.
I think I have the next one. This is kind of just a minor question, but are there like slash commands for this? I'm not sure if maybe you showed that and I missed it.
It's not in here. There's an issue for it. I think it's, if I remember right, just slash status, and then it would kind of prompt your list of available statuses, kind of the same as labels, basically.
I also just want to say I literally had a situation yesterday that came up that would have been solved by this, because there was an issue I had closed and someone commented, was like, how do I test the changes you made? I was like, oh, sorry, no, this is like a won't do.
Yep. Common. Emily, I don't know where we're at with time, but I'm happy to answer more questions if we have more time.
Since we only have two presentations, I think we can go to the bottom of the hour.
Yeah, I got another question for you then, Nick. So for isolating statuses, I like that idea. I was also curious, just as you're looking at the way different teams categorize their issues based on label structure, might there be other things we would consider isolating too one day? Like we use 3 issues to tell you what team this issue is worked on, or 3 labels to tell you what team is working on an issue. We use maybe one-to-many labels to tell you what roles are responsible for carrying out the work.
Yeah, definitely. It's so we're actually doing some research right now that the Danika's leading around custom fields. But as part of that, one of the things I think we're finding is like, what are the common set of fields that like almost every team is using, right? And it is like status, priority, and team. I think are the 3. I don't know if Danika's on here. She could correct me if there was one I forgot. But I think those are the 3 that tend to rise to the top. Where we could also consider sort of what like first class support for that looks like. I think priority is a pretty easy one, right? Like we could create a list of priorities. I don't think that would be something we would have to really allow a lot of customization for. Team opens up a whole other can of problems and concerns, like what that means, but I do think there would be a lot of value in that. And then we are like, one of the other things on our roadmap is custom fields, which is something where people run into problems with labels today, right? They want, we kind of tell them, if you want to use custom data, you can use labels, but that doesn't really work for like free text input or something. Like I've even seen a customer try to do that, where they created a label like every time for like free text input. So you had all these one-off labels. I do not believe, continued doing that for very long, because it would just get unwieldy. But I think, yeah, we have a set of common things that we want to support, and then also give users tools to sort of support the other things that they might want.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Pedro.
Hi, Nick. Thanks so much for sharing this. Yeah, I really want to praise that you're reusing existing components and not reinventing the wheel. And also specifically, I think some people also mentioned always showing the text label of the status instead of just relying on the icon. And this is, not just like a UX concern in general, but it reminded me of my hard times with Jira some years ago when we had like different versions of closed, like resolved, won't do, done, things like that. And it had almost the same icon, and I couldn't tell which version of closed for that work item it was. So I always had to hover or open the work item and so on. More specifically, I think there's really something to that your exploration of toning down the labels to try to emphasize the status. Yeah, as we've also looked into this for quite some time, the usage of labels, we're at GitLab, we're an outlier in that we abuse labels. We're probably like the 99 percentile of the usage of labels and the diversity of labels. But I think it's worthwhile to explore that. And maybe another exploration could be, in addition to that approach of using a colored dot, would be to try to retain the colored border so that the choice of color is not only that little dot. But yeah, it's a balance, and I appreciate you working through that.
Yeah, that is something that we explored, right? Like, could we just use like the colored icon for all of these, right? And then it's like, okay, this is in design and this is in QA. Will you remember that this is blue and this is purple, or these are both blue? Will you be able to tell the difference? It gets really, I think we're asking too much of somebody to be able to recall those things. So, it is something that we'll basically always expose.
Yeah, and there are just there are not that many different colors that you could use for all of those like different states, right? And you're basically, to make things easier for users, you either have like blue, green, red, orange, purple, and that's more or less it. Maybe black, I don't know. If you start adding like the nuances of indigo, deep blue, light blue, it's a mess. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, and two things, just to wrap up, two things in particular that I'm a little uncertain about is the way you're reducing the visibility of confidentiality, and also the seemingly like the disconnect visually that you have between the state, like an open or closed work item, and its status. And I would feel like in some of the examples you showed inside of an epic, for example, those are very close to each other, so you could easily understand how they're related. But in a list of work items, they're very far apart. And I had to jump back and forth to understand where that relationship is, and I would expect them to be closer. But yeah, just food for thought. Thank you again.
Yeah, just on the confidentiality point, we explored those changes. None of that's changing as part of this. We may just be not showing like confidential in some of the items because items aren't always confidential. But yeah, there shouldn't be any actual deprecation to that as a result of this.
All right, thanks so much for the presentation, Nick, and thanks everyone for the questions.